I didn't cry at my father's funeral. I stood there, rain pressing its cold fingers into my collar, and watched the coffin sink like an empire giving up its last breath. Everyone around me pretended grief. I pretended to believe them. The priest said ashes to ashes, but the man we buried had turned to stone long before the dirt touched him. The estate looked smaller that day, like the sky had stooped to listen. Hastingsberry, my inheritance, my cage. Father built it on discipline, so sharp it could draw blood. "Control is the only love you'll ever need," he once told me, and I lived by that, until I realized control was just loneliness dressed in authority. After the burial, I locked myself in his study. The air still smelled of cigar smoke and cedar polish, the sort of scent that lingers like judgment. I poured his scotch, 30 years old, amber like resentment, and sat in his chair. The leather groaned under my weight as if rejecting the new occupant. That's when I opened the will. His handwriting, perfect as a sermon, delivered one last command. Within 30 days, my son Edward shall marry Milana Valand or forfeit all claim to Hastingsberry holdings. A laugh escaped me, bitter enough to sting. Marry a stranger to keep what's already mine? Typical. Father couldn't control me in life, so he'd tighten his grip from the grave. I drank again, the burn cutting through the fog, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice behind me, correcting my posture, my tone, my worth. I tore the envelope apart, but the words wouldn't die. They sat in my mind, glowing with that same cruel precision. I imagined this Milana, some polished socialite eager to cash in on a family name, a pawn maybe, or worse, a reflection of his choosing. Grief and fury tangled inside me, both too proud to yield. I laughed again, then slammed the glass down so hard the rim splintered. The scotch bled into the wood, leaving a stain darker than it should have been. Outside, the estate grounds shimmered under gray light, wet stone, trimmed hedges, a pond still enough to mirror guilt. I thought about walking out there, shouting into the quiet, just to prove I was still the one making choices. But then the weight of legacy pressed harder, and I stayed seated, caged by inheritance, by duty, by the memory of a man who never learned how to love. When the lawyer called to confirm the arrangement, I didn't ask questions. I signed what needed signing, poured another drink, and let the estate fall back into its silence. The staff moved around me like ghosts, speaking in lowered tones, as if the walls might repeat their gossip. That night, I dreamed of footsteps on the gravel path, a figure in black, face hidden, veil trailing in the wind. I woke with the image still in my chest, a strange calm spreading where anger should have been. I didn't know it yet, but my father's last act of control would introduce me to the only person capable of undoing it. The wedding felt less like a union and more like a verdict. A gray morning, thin sunlight stretching through the chapel windows as though embarrassed to intrude. My name echoed off the marble, hollow and rehearsed. I watched her, Milana Valand, walk the aisle in silence, her veil falling like a curtain the world wasn't invited behind. People leaned forward to see her face, greedy for spectacle. I could feel their curiosity crawling over us, 1,000 eyes scratching for proof of scandal or salvation. I stood stiff, the perfect heir performing the perfect duty, while inside I was nothing but smoke and defiance. When she reached me, I caught a glimpse of her mouth, soft but unreadable. No tremor, no fear. She didn't reach for my hand until the priest prompted her. Even then, her fingers were steady, cool as stone. "Do you take—" "Yes," she said, cutting clean through the question. The congregation murmured. I caught the faintest trace of sandalwood when she passed me the ring. My hand trembled. Hers did not. Afterward at the reception, I tried to look like a man enjoying his fortune. Champagne fizzed against my tongue, and I smiled at men who secretly measured how long I'd last under her composure. A woman at the table whispered, "She must be hiding something," loud enough for the string quartet to falter. Milana said nothing. She sat upright, posture regal, veil still untouched. Every tilt of her head dismissed gossip like dust off marble. That restraint, it infuriated me. If she'd cried or explained herself, I could have pitied her. But she gave them nothing, not even her anger. Later, alone in our house, the silence stretched. The candles flickered in the reflection of the parlor mirror, making us look like strangers inhabiting someone else's lives. I poured a drink, leaned against the piano, and said, "You've managed quite the performance." She turned slightly, voice low, even. "If their opinions matter more to you than your own peace, reconsider this marriage." It landed like a challenge, not a plea. She walked past me and up the stairs, veil brushing the banister. I stared after her, the scent of her perfume, something faintly citrus, left floating in the air, refusing to vanish. I wanted to shout, to demand why she hid, what game she was playing. Instead, I sat in that same stillness she seemed born to command. Somewhere in it, I felt my own arrogance looking back at me. Outside, the last of the guests drove away, headlights slicing through the fog. Hastingsberry's windows glowed like watchful eyes. The estate had seen marriages forged for power before, but never one that hummed with so much restraint, so much unspoken rebellion. That night I dreamt again of the figure in black, veil trailing in the wind. But this time, when she turned, the wind went still. It started subtly, the way the air in Hastingsberry changed when she settled in. Servants began moving with purpose, the clatter of trays softened, and even the old grandfather clock seemed to find its rhythm again. I told myself it was coincidence, but the house had always mirrored its masters, and this order was not mine. Milana rose early, always unseen, but always leaving traces. A vase straightened, correspondence sorted, a note in the margins of my ledgers correcting a figure I'd missed. Her handwriting, precise, slanted, confident, carried the same tone as her voice that night in the parlor, unbothered. I hated how easily it steadied the chaos I'd let grow around me. One afternoon I found her in Father's old library. She stood by the window reading a book in French, sunlight sketching patterns on her veil. The room felt smaller, as if her calm consumed the air. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did and simply didn't care to acknowledge it. "You've reorganized the staff," I said, pretending it was a question. "I've clarified their duties," she replied, turning a page. "Efficiency prevents resentment." I almost laughed. "You've been here a week, and already they breathe easier." It wasn't arrogance. Worse, it was truth. I wanted to argue, but found nothing worth saying. She went back to her book, the hem of her dress grazing the rug like a whisper of defiance. Later that evening, I reviewed documents for a merger that could make or break the company. My father's methods had left our holdings brittle, bound by ego more than logic. I noticed a red mark on one clause, hers. In the margin, a single note. Rephrase this. Liability hides here. I checked the numbers. She was right. One phrase, one oversight could have gutted the entire deal. I stared at the ink until the candle guttered. Pride clawed at my throat. A part of me wanted to confront her, to ask how she knew so much about business law, about me. But another part, the quieter, less practiced one, wanted to listen. The next morning, the house greeted me like an accomplice in my own confusion. The staff nodded differently, deferential not to my name, but to her influence. It infuriated me that control could be taken not through demand, but through calm. At breakfast, she asked if the merger meeting went well. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It did, I said carefully. Good, she answered, voice mild. You corrected the clause. It wasn't a question. That night I stood outside her door, listening. Inside, the faint rustle of papers, the dip of a chair, a page turning. She was working again, shaping something invisible between us. Authority, perhaps, or trust. I walked away before she caught me there, before I could ask the one question that had begun to gnaw beneath my anger. How could a woman I barely knew understand this empire better than I did? Weeks passed, and Hastingsberry stopped feeling haunted. The air softened, the clocks aligned, even the fireplaces learned her rhythm. Steady, unhurried, deliberate. Milana's presence had the quiet force of tidewater, reshaping the edges of everything without a word. I started noticing details I used to overlook. The polished banister reflecting morning light, the faint trace of jasmine on the stairwell, the way the house staff smiled again, like they'd remembered how. She never raised her voice, never issued orders. She simply expected calm, and the world complied. One night I came down late for a drink and heard music. A piano, faint and patient, coming from the drawing room. Father had forbidden music in the house after Mother died, said it was a distraction. Hearing it now was like discovering a new color in a portrait I thought finished. Milana sat at the keys, veil undone, dark hair gathered loosely at her neck. The melody was simple, sad, but deliberate, as if she were teaching herself to feel in small, controlled doses. I didn't move. I just watched the curve of her hands, the light catching her wedding band, and the rise and fall of her shoulders. Something in me cracked then. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of grief for all the tenderness I'd never been taught to show. When she finished, she sensed me in the doorway. You shouldn't sneak up on people, she said softly, not turning around. I wasn't sneaking, I lied. I was listening. She closed the piano lid. Then you heard enough. The next day, a meeting at the firm spiraled into chaos. Two partners nearly walked. The deal teetered, and every instinct I inherited screamed at me to dominate, to control. But her voice echoed in my head. Efficiency prevents resentment. So I listened, and recalibrated, and offered compromise instead of command. That single choice saved the merger. When I came home, she was pruning the roses by the conservatory, gloves dusted with soil. I told her in as few words as pride would allow that her suggestion had been useful. She smiled just once, small, genuine, almost invisible, and said, "Good. Then the house can rest tonight." That phrase stayed with me.
the house can rest, as if the estate itself were alive, waiting for harmony between us to breathe. I found myself watching her reflection in glass instead of her face, easier somehow to study someone who didn't need to be seen to command attention. Her restraint was a kind of elegance my world had never rewarded. Later that week, I realized I'd gone an entire day without resenting her. That scared me more than any argument could have.
London gleamed that night like it was built for deception. Chandeliers dripping with light, laughter sharp enough to wound. The Hastingsberry name was back in circulation, polished, whispered, weighed, and we were expected to perform. Milana arrived on my arm, veil intact, gown the color of fresh ash. Every head turned, some in awe, most in speculation. I caught my reflection in a mirrored column, her stillness beside my practiced smile, and wondered when I'd started drawing confidence from her calm. The first hour passed in harmless chatter. Then came Lord Wexley, an heir to arrogance, cheeks flushed from brandy and entitlement. He bowed low before her, voice carrying just enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear. "My lady, does your husband keep you veiled to preserve mystery or to conceal regret?" Laughter rippled around us, brittle as crystal. I felt heat rise in my throat. Milana didn't flinch. She lifted her glass, the gesture precise, and said nothing. Wexley smirked. "Ah, silence, the last refuge of obedience." Before I knew it, I was standing, glass set down too hard, pulse hammering in my ears. "Careful, my lord. Silence can also be mercy." He chuckled. "Mercy? For whom?" "For those too small to recognize dignity when they see it." The room froze. Music faltered. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. I turned to the crowd, their eyes expectant, hungry. I said, "You call it a veil, but perhaps you mistake reflection for concealment. Her veil is not a wall, it's a mirror. What you see in it says more about you than about her." Someone gasped. Someone else set down a glass too quickly. Wexley paled, stammered something about jest, and retreated into the crowd. Milana's hand brushed mine under the table, barely a touch, but electric. Gratitude? Warning? I couldn't tell. Later, outside on the terrace, the cold bit through my tuxedo. She stood beside me, veil fluttering in the breeze, moonlight trembling across the silk. "You didn't have to do that," she said, quietly. "I know." "But you wanted to." I looked at her then, really looked. "You shouldn't have to fight for dignity in a room full of cowards." She turned her head toward me, veil shifting just enough for her eyes to catch the light, steady, unreadable, almost sad. "I've been fighting longer than you've been watching." The city lights below blurred into gold threads. Somewhere behind us, the ballroom resumed its music, louder now, as if to erase what had happened. But it couldn't. Something in that room had cracked. Public perception, yes, but also the wall between us. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, waiting.
The gossip lasted a week, maybe 2. The papers called her the veiled reformer, the woman who turned the Hastings heir into a gentleman. I should have been insulted, but every headline felt like proof of something shifting, something I hadn't earned but now wanted to protect. Milana moved through the aftermath as though she'd expected it all. She ignored the invitations, the interviews, the speculation about her lineage. "Attention is currency," she said once over breakfast, "and I prefer to keep my wealth quiet." I'd never met anyone so fluent in stillness. We found a rhythm, unspoken, deliberate. She tended to the garden at dawn, and I worked until dusk, our paths crossing just enough to remind the house that peace was possible. The more I tried to decipher her, the more I realized how little I understood about grace that doesn't beg to be seen. One evening, she joined me in the study, where the fire cast shadows on Father's portrait. I'd been staring at those eyes for too long, remembering every correction he had ever delivered. Milana followed my gaze. "He taught you control, but not balance." Her voice was soft, not cruel. "I'm learning," I murmured. She tilted her head. "Then learn this. You don't need to earn quiet. You can just have it." I wanted to tell her that I didn't know how, that my whole life had been noise dressed as purpose. Instead, I said, "You've changed this place." She smiled slightly. "No, I've just made it honest." The fire popped between us, releasing the scent of cedar and smoke. The air thickened, not with tension, but with recognition. "Milana, why keep the veil?" She looked directly at me, her eyes calm but unyielding. "Because I choose how I'm seen. That's all the freedom I've ever asked for." Something inside me steadied. For the first time, her silence didn't feel like separation. It felt like sanctuary. After she left, I sat in Father's chair, listening to the crackle of the fire. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. When I passed her door later, I paused, hearing faint movement inside, pages turning, soft music, the sound of someone at peace. I realized I didn't need to see her face to know I'd started to love her.
Winter arrived on a hush. Snow wrapped the estate in forgiveness, and for the first time since the funeral, Hastingsberry felt new, like it had exhaled. The gala came almost by accident, arranged by the board to celebrate our merger's success. I'd wanted to cancel, but Milana insisted. "Let them see what's been rebuilt," she said. I didn't realize she meant more than the company. The night of the event, I waited at the foot of the staircase, guests murmuring around me, champagne glasses trembling in candlelight. My reflection caught in the window, a man both owner and owned by the legacy he'd once cursed. Then the room shifted. A hush fell so complete it startled the pianist into silence. Milana stood at the top of the stairs, veil gone. The sight of her didn't stun because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked certain. Every step was measured, not performed. Her hair gleamed under the chandelier, her expression calm, unbothered by the gasps and camera flashes. The very air rearranged itself around her. A reporter whispered, "So that's her." And I thought, no, that's her now. When she reached me, I offered my arm. She didn't take it. She stood beside me instead, her voice low but clear enough to travel the marble. I wanted to be known for what I build, not for how I look. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was respect, raw and real. Someone began to clap. Another joined. The sound swelled until the chandelier itself seemed to hum with it. In that moment, the Hastings name no longer belonged to my father's ghost or my rebellion. It belonged to her steadiness, our shared defiance. Later, after the speeches and the endless hands to shake, I found her by the conservatory. Snow pressed against the glass. Her reflection merged with mine. "You didn't have to," I said. "She did," she answered. "There's power in choosing when you're seen." I nodded. "You've changed everything." She smiled, a quiet, knowing curve. "No, Edward, you finally looked." For once, I couldn't speak. The world beyond the glass glowed white, and the faint sound of piano drifted from the ballroom. a melody that used to mean loneliness, now reborn as promise.
The snow stayed for days, blanketing the estate like a truce. For the first time in memory, Hastingsberry was quiet without feeling hollow. Inside, the fire snapped softly. The staff laughed in the kitchen. Even the walls seemed to stand easier, freed from the echo of my father's rules. Milana sat by the window, reading reports by the soft light of morning. The board had just voted her onto the executive team, unanimously. Her name printed beside mine on the letterhead looked right, like something that should have always been there. When I told her, she only nodded, eyes still on the page. They'll expect me to prove I belong. You already have. She glanced up. Not to them. There was no bitterness in it, just truth. I crossed the room, drawn by the quiet authority that had once unnerved me. Her hands were ink-stained from hours of notes. I found that beautiful. Evidence of work, not ornament. I used to think legacy meant preservation. Now I see its evolution. Milana smiled faintly. Then maybe you've learned what power actually is. We spent that afternoon drafting a new mission for Hastingsberry Holdings, one that replaced control with stewardship. We argued, rewrote, laughed once or twice when our pens crossed on the same line. I realized I wasn't defending my inheritance anymore. I was sharing it. By evening, the snow outside glowed pink under the setting sun. She stood by the fire, its light painting her face in gold and shadow. "You see clearly now," she said. "I do, and I'd like to keep seeing." She reached out, not for comfort, but for alignment, her hand resting lightly on mine. No vows, no theatrics, just two people finally inhabiting the same silence. Later, walking the corridor once haunted by my father's portrait, I stopped and looked at the empty space where it used to hang. Milana had it moved weeks ago to a side hall, said every empire needs a memory, but not a master. I didn't argue. Outside, the last of the snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, like punctuation. The house breathed in rhythm with the fire, and for the first time, I knew freedom didn't mean leaving. It meant choosing how to stay. Tomorrow, the company will announce its new leadership. Edward and Milana, Hastings, co-chairs. The world will measure us, test us, doubt us. Let them. This time, the weight is shared. I poured us both a drink, the good kind he would have hoarded, and raised my glass to clarity. She clinked hers against mine, to choice. The firelight caught her smile, and in it I saw not conclusion, but beginning.